All right, hello everybody, and welcome to this Thinking Cloudy episode expert talk for Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. We're going to talk about the understanding of the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure.
And I'll go ahead and intro myself. I'm Shannon Kuehn. I am a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. My career's been interesting. I didn't start in IT. I started my career thinking that I was going to be doing something in marketing or something like market research, and found my way into technology, fell in love with it. Over the course of my career, I've gotten deeper and deeper and moved into the cloud. So in the last almost 5 years, I've been 100% all in with Azure. So I work with community outreach, trying to get customers comfortable with what a journey into Azure looks like related to their digital transformation. So a lot of what we do is speaking events, evangelizing, blog content creation, video creation. So that's kind of what my role is like at Microsoft.
And my name is Dwayne Natwick. I am a cloud training architect lead at Opsagility and Skill Me Up. I'm also a Microsoft Azure MVP with multiple level layers and years of experience within the IT environment, both with networking and phone systems and servers and things like that. Also a certified trainer and regional lead for the certified trainer program. So in this session today, we're going to talk about and give a introduction and a background to the cloud adoption framework for Azure. So, and talk about what that framework is, how you can utilize the assessment and planning tools for implementing that framework, and then how you can use the cloud adoption framework for a model of governance within your environment. So Shannon, why don't you give everybody a background on the cloud adoption framework?
Sure. So when it comes into play here, we had customers coming to us with, how do we make use of the cloud? How do we get ourselves started? And so what Microsoft did was they had garnered a lot of different feedback over the course of, I don't remember exactly how long it was in its incubation period. But what Microsoft did was they leaned on customers who had already made that journey, and they developed patterns and practices to follow. What happened then was we packaged it up into a framework. So, when we think about moving things into Azure, we think about a migration path first and foremost, especially if you don't have anything in Azure. A lot of customers still are trying to figure out how to make use of Azure. And so some of the ways you can think about it are this phased iterative approach. The Cloud Adoption Framework provides a lot of interesting components here to flesh out some of the motivations behind why you're deciding to move. Maybe it's a data center exit. Maybe it's something along the lines of, you don't want to think about refreshing your hardware on-prem. Maybe you're merging with a different company. There's a lot of different ways in which to think about making use of cloud. And so really, this is an organized approach, kind of a cookie cutter approach, but it's just like following a recipe in a recipe book, right? You have your ingredients listed out, your instructions listed out. You have the capability of tweaking it to your heart's content, so to speak. And what it turns into is it becomes this awesome way of thinking about how to operationalize yourself and make some of those migration patterns happen, so you can then move into other phases like innovating, modernizing, etc. So when you think about the adoption process, right? So, you have to think about the balance between culture and costs. So unfortunately, this digital disruption has a bunch of different reactions when you go and you talk with customers, because of the fact that folks really aren't ready to some degree to have the change that needs to happen, right? So you have to first get buy-in from the high levels up, right? And usually that's a decision that's made at the kind of the C level. From there, you have to get a team of folks together to start really looking at everything that builds out your IT environment. You need to really understand how that CapEx model turns into OpEx, especially because your accountants are going to probably have a bunch of questions for you. From there, you have to think about skilling. Skilling's a big part here. You need to upskill your IT folks so that they can handle what cloud looks like. Since everything's software defined, it's a little more REST API driven than putting a disk into a server and clicking next, 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 and installing software, right? So everything's a lot different, but it's helping you out related to automation. You simply are, well, if you think about it, you're creating a data center kind of to some degree in the cloud. You're not, but you're kind of also building out an opportunity to figure out kind of how you want to make yourself live in the cloud. But you have to kind of balance that with costs, right? Because a lot of times when customers first started on this journey, they do it very iteratively. They'll start in with a lot of different ideas on workloads to migrate, and then they'll look at that bill and they will freak out. So there are things to think about so that you don't spend so much and get yourself into a trickier spot. So really, it's a matter of you have to have more conversations out the gate initially, just because of the fact that it's going to be one of those things that you need buy-in from a number of different avenues. And then when it comes to the cloud maturity stages, so you have to think about experimenting, right? You have to think about what an initial framework would look like. So if you are a heavy regulated firm, you'll have to figure out the security baselines you'll need to factor in. You'll have to think about some of the architecture patterns. So if you are doing that data center exit, maybe it makes sense to lift and shift your environment into Azure without having to think through what that would actually look like if you went to a more PaaS build out, or maybe even like a SaaS solution as well, right? And from there, you think about kind of building out your initial foundation, so to speak. So you play around with policy, you play around with security baselines, identity baselines, you come up with this whole way of thinking through organizing your resources. And then what happens is, after that first wave, you start to pick up and you start to get yourself in this faster pattern of being able to be closer to cloud native. You have already automated a lot of the risks. You've mitigated that in the process of having a lot of these conversations up front. And from there, you can think about leaning on blueprints to sort of help out as well. So, there's a lot of different tools that we'll talk about throughout the course of this, but those are really helpful because it really gives you that guide of how you want to see your entire environment be built.
And it's really about making that whole transformation in not just your infrastructure, but your entire organization as a whole, right?
Agreed. And I think it's a change for everybody, right? So your traditional sysadmins are the ones that probably might have some hesitation. Developers too. It's a little bit of an unknown, right? And the beauty is we're all kind of in that same boat, right? I have joked often with folks in the community that I feel more like an infrastructure developer versus a true infrastructure person anymore because I haven't touched a physical server for over 6 years now. So, your skills evolve and they shift and they change. And it's a matter of kind of staying up to date with the ways in which things are changing and making sure you have a good group of folks to provide that feedback loop. So when we think about business drivers, first and foremost, I think every C-level executive has read every Gartner report, all of these Newsweek stories or Information Week stories that talk about how cloud is the future. So they want to modernize, they want to add agility, right? They want to be able to take advantage of the cloud versus having to continue to spend money on servers that are essentially sunk costs, right? From there, you think about transformation, right? So how the business will continue to operate and interact with their market offerings, right? So how could we take what we do today that lives in an IIS server? How can we think about moving it into a web app? How could we think about making this be a faster reality? How could we think about multiple stages? Could we think about a test environment? Could we think about a dev environment, a staging environment, and a production environment? So there's ways in which you can take advantage of cloud, and the transformation phase is usually like an iterative approach, but usually customers want to have some sort of transformation piece here become that impetus to move forward. From there, you think about growth. So a lot of customers are running out of capacity in their current data center. And, sometimes the executive management is a little apprehensive about sinking in tens of thousands of, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars on brand new equipment. But you still have to be able to grow with your workloads. You still have to be able to scale up and scale down on demand. So one of the ways you can think about, you adopting the cloud is thinking about the idea of being able to lean on the cloud in terms of scaling up and scaling down. From there, there's also the option of business returns, right? So that becomes another business driver why somebody would think about adopting the cloud. So I've worked with so many customers over the course of the last almost 5 years. And I've had customers who really like this idea of being able to spin up and spin down environments to test theories, to run models, to get an idea on all of the data they can kind of generate over a course of a handful of hours, or maybe it's even minutes, right? So you have capacity to see data in a lot of different ways, and you have capacity to use I call it, destructible infrastructure, in the sense that it's not going to be there for years and years, and it's not going to be a pet, right? It's going to be really a cattle. And it's the idea of being able to think about some of those returns coming back to you in a really positive way. So when we think about, drivers for IT governance, right? So when we think about cloud, speed comes into play here. So you want to make sure that while your company is moving forward in a fast fashion, that your risk is kept at acceptable levels. So you have to come up with a policy, you have to come up with a plan. You can't just go and deploy, because you'll have the sprawling problems that some of the early adopters of Azure had, right? They gave access to developers, they gave access to sysadmins, to security engineers, and all of a sudden had this ridiculously expansive environment, hundreds of subscriptions, thousands of resources. Nobody really knew who was the key person. A lot of folks had too high of level of access, so they could go in and they could build all kinds of stuff. So you want to make sure you keep your risk at acceptable levels, and that's what the governance plan would do. From there, you would think about maintaining the availability to systems and services, so you can have a plan for mission critical servers, meaning they won't go down during business hours. And this is why you'd have to have a big conversation with different stakeholders within the business, just to make sure that everybody's getting what they're looking for related to resiliency and uptime. And you can also apply policy, and you can audit on compliance inside Azure, whether you're using Azure native tooling or whether you're using something that's a third-party tool. You've got an ability to define what everything looks like and then to audit against it to make sure everybody's in compliance. So I've worked with customers that are very much so, kind of draconian in nature, meaning they want to have a tag on a VM or a series of tags, otherwise you can't create the VM. I've worked with other customers who allow the VM to be created, but if there are no tags, they get this awesome auditing report that showcases the ways in which people are not adopting Azure the way that everybody agreed upon based on the governance plan. So these become drivers, and then from there, obviously the big piece is to make sure that customer data is protected. So those firms that are dealing with HIPAA information or any sort of sensitive information, you want to make sure that you've got a plan for that. And I guess the big key here is you want to look before you leap, because when you leap, sometimes you get stuck in these environments that you think it's test, but it becomes production very quickly. And then nobody really knows how that became production. So when we think about the framework for Azure, let's see here. So the framework itself is, you've got the strategy. Let's see, I think there we go. Yeah, we'll go with the building the framework slide. So it's think of it like a modular approach, right? So you want to meet the customer in their journey, and that's what the framework really does. So it provides a lot of detailed guidance on building that strategy so that you can actualize what it's going to look like when everything lives in Azure or when a good chunk of your environment lives in Azure. Then once you have the strategy built and kind of that foundation laid, from there you can think about planning what comes next, right? So then you can start to think about the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, the ones that are easy to move in without a lot of issues, getting everything up and functional. Once you go through a handful of those, or a handful of that planning cycles, you can start to think about getting everything ready for production. That's when you build out your POCs, maybe some of your MVPs. So POCs is a proof of concept. MVP is minimal viable product. Both of those come into play here in that ready phase. That's where you're building kind of that, you're building that muscle so you understand what that cloud adoption is going to look like. And then from there, you can really start to adopt the cloud at scale, right? So you have capacity to think about moving things quickly and having no issue related to that increased agility, because you'll have the governance pieces mapped out and you'll have the management plane kind of mapped out as well. And the objective of the model really is just to create a balance, right? Like I talked about earlier, a lot of customers, when they first started consuming Azure, it became this sprawling Azure environment where they had hundreds of subscriptions, tens of thousands of resources. Nobody had RBAC policies in place, so everybody had the same level of access. Without a lot of good guidance, there wasn't really an idea on how to move forward. Certain developers knew they just needed contributor rights to be able to build whatever they wanted to build, right? And system administrators needed the same rights to build whatever they wanted to build. Well, then we started getting ourselves into this trickier spot, and that's when Microsoft started to ask for feedback and build out this policy, or build out this framework. It's not really a policy, the framework, right? So you want to make sure that you have the control and stability mapped with the speed and results, because I think everybody wants to get to this very agile mindset as quickly as possible. So having the CAF in place lets you have that control, lets you build up the automation, build up the muscles, so to speak, so that you can get to that point where you have the speed and results of what you're looking for related to transformation.
All right, give you a break now. So let's talk about this framework. Shannon hit on the overview of that framework. Let's talk about it a little bit more in detail here with what each of those areas and those pieces provide in terms of that framework and that guidance that that Microsoft has put together for your journey to Azure. So as Shannon hit on before, there are these four top level pieces to the workflow essentially, and to the roadmap and framework that we're looking at adopting the cloud and adopting Azure. And it's the defined strategy, the plan, the ready, and the adopt. And then under that, as was mentioned, there is how we're then going to govern and manage those environments, which is an important piece to that whole puzzle, right? And the success to that puzzle. So, first and foremost, we talk about these, how we're going to find out from a business standpoint what the outcomes are, what the motivations are, to be able to plan then where we're going to go and how we're going to align that within our organization before we're then ready, and we build out those first blueprints and those first stakes in the ground, and provide then the validation around that's the direction we need to go before we start to then adopt more workloads and to migrate workloads in terms of lift and shift environment, or to innovate and transform our applications and really turn into that agile business that Shannon hit on. And we're going to hit on each one of these a little bit more in detail on the following slides. So let's talk more about the defining of the strategy. And really, this comes down to determining and to documenting what the ultimate goal is going to be. What are we trying to accomplish as an organization, that, or a consulting firm working with a business, or a managed service provider working with a business, that's building and finding, with the business stakeholders, with engineering, with all of the people that are important to this journey. What are we putting down on paper, and what are we doing to adopt the cloud and to adopt Azure? Here's where we are today. Where are we trying to get to tomorrow? And what needs to be done potentially in between? And what time frame are we on? So we start to determine, is it because of these certain motivations on the slide, such as mergers and acquisitions, and cost savings, optimization. Shannon mentioned, growth. Mergers and acquisitions is a point of that. But if we're growing and we don't want to put in additional capital expenses into hardware or additional real estate for data centers, this is a motivating factor for that. And then, what are the business outcomes? Where are we going? What are we trying to accomplish? Or are they fiscally driven by cost and profit and revenues of our company? Again, another reason why we don't want to invest in real estate. Everybody within most geographies right now are utilizing remote work for their users. So do we want to have a building with a bunch of hardware in it anymore? The agility, the reach, are we growing beyond our particular country? And then do we have sovereignty rules for data that we need to take into account? What level of our customer engagement? Are we trying to be more agile and trying to meet customer needs and demands on a faster basis? And then performance. What is important to us in terms of the reliability, the high availability, the security of our organization. Then some more, business justifications on top of that. Once we have what our outcomes are, what's the justification of it? Do we have a business case for it? Is it going to provide our organization with some level of benefit? And it might not be a cost benefit per se. It might be a geographic benefit. It might be a ability to handle and to move capex to opex and have a greater return on our overall investment. The depreciation of physical equipment and things like that also fall into play as well. And then, once we've defined all of these business justifications and motivations, what are we going to do in terms of our first project? What is the criteria of it? What's the business reason for it? And then how are we going to analyze that and utilize, what dependencies are we going to have? And what are we going to, how are we going to evaluate that and analyze what the team requires to determine success in that first project? So once we've determined all of that, now what do we do and how do we plan for this adoption? And so here is where we start building and determining what that digital estate is going to be, and what we're going to need in terms of our inventory of Azure services. Again, we're doing some quantitative instead of qualitative analysis of optimizing those assets and sizing things properly in terms of what level of compute services we need in terms of whether we're going to use platform services or infrastructure services or SaaS services and things like that. And what is then going to be the operational process of us adopting that plan, and then aligning our organization to that digital estate and that plan. What is that? What is our team? What are our business requirements and needs from a business IT standpoint, from a operations standpoint, from a traditional IT standpoint, from a security, governance, executive sponsorship, finance, And then really, from a platform standpoint, choosing the proper platform, uh, who is, who's helping us out from a Microsoft standpoint to on our journey, who's helping us from if an enterprise standpoint, who's helping us, are we utilizing a third party cloud service solution provider to help us with this journey as well? What knowledge and what knowledge gaps do we have that we need to fill internally with external resources and things like that? And then what is that minimal viable product that Shannon hit on in terms of governing that, and what are we using as a determining factor to what that MVP is, the minimal viable product is, when we are finished with our adoption. And then I hit on this a little bit on the previous thing, from a skills readiness standpoint. What are our technical skills and certifications that we need? Is that aligned with what we have in terms of our own organizational goals? Do we need to utilize other resources through Microsoft or the Microsoft partner ecosystem to help us fill some of those gaps and fill those technical skills? What is our organizational readiness and our change management going to look like? How is this going to affect not just the business, but our users and our customers? There may be identifying what the changes how those might affect how they're going to interact with those resources that we're moving to cloud and adopting cloud versus an on-premises environment. And then finally, creating that plan and creating that strategy. And we mentioned here the 5R strategy of, are we going to rehost, refactor, re-architect, rebuild, or replace? That's really important, especially when we get to that ready and adopt phase that's coming up. Is, what are we doing here? Rehosting is really just taking that and migrating what you have in your current data center and bringing it over into Azure. Not always, that there could be drivers and motivators to doing that, like hardware depreciation and things like that, but it might not be a complete benefit to the organization. Infrastructure migration, what are we doing in terms of, the virtual machines, the servers, the database, and focusing on our actual infrastructure, the innovation of our applications, the cloud native applications that were mentioned previously, and becoming more transformational within our organization. And then data driven innovation. Lots of, and Shannon hit on this when she mentioned building development environments to run data models and things like that within Azure, and being able to bring those in, test those, do analysis and break it down. There's a lot of data that's being consumed and being brought in and being accumulated by organizations through so many connected devices out there. So there's a lot of data-driven innovation that can take place within the organization that help with that cloud adoption plan and accelerate that cloud adoption plan. So Shannon, you want to talk about the readiness portion of this?
Sure. So, once you've gone through the plan and defined the strategy, you'll find yourself at the ready phase where you're taking a look at resource management. So you'll want to figure out, how many subscriptions do we need? How many resource groups? What's the model of resource group? Is the application going to all live in one resource group? Are we going to shove a number of applications into one resource group? This is where you start to really figure out how you're going to build your environment. From there, you'll think through maybe the hierarchy, right? Are you going to bring about management groups? Are you going to, think about RBAC? Who's going to have access to all of this? Are you going to put different business units in different subscriptions? Sometimes that's an adoption model that makes a lot of sense, especially if, HR's got a lot of interesting apps that are going on, and marketing has a bunch of interesting apps as well, and you want to kind of understand what those costs look like. Sometimes it's easier to have that dividing line be the subscription. From there, you'll think about naming standards. You'll think about, the idea of How do we name our resources? There's certain limitations in Azure, namely things like that have a DNS tie to it, so storage accounts, Cosmos DB, etc. And you want to possibly talk about your tagging strategy. Then you move into the landing zone infrastructure, and we'll talk about this in greater detail. I think it's in 2 weeks, where we'll talk about what that landing zone infrastructure looks like, where you've got your networking figured out, you've got your firewall, maybe your hub subscription figured out. You'll figure out if you need to deploy front door or what type of endpoints you need, right? You'll think about your storage design. So you'll have, disks, files, blobs. Maybe you'll build out a CDN. Maybe you'll think about your compute design. So you want to have your infrastructure folks be able to deploy everything but maybe an M series VM. You could think about adding some policies in to prevent really expensive VMs to be created, but you're fine with them going in and building what they need to in order to have this landing zone. And then you'll think about kind of your data design too. So is it going to be structured or unstructured? Once you get to that point, you'll move into like kind of the landing zone ID. This is where you really start to figure out the access model. What does it look like related to who gets access to what? Are you going to lock down environments? Are you going to make things be restricted in the sense that only a handful of people can really understand the subscription where the express route terminates, for example? That will cause a lot of headache and heartburn if the event something happened to that subscription. So you probably want to lock that one down, right? And then you want to figure out the idea here of the least privilege, right? So you don't want to move forward and give everybody access to everything, because as we've learned, that's not really a great reality. You might have a sprawling environment and no real control over it. When we think about the landing zone cost, this will give you the idea of what it costs to kind of have that landing zone in a ready state, right? So usually these are the environments that can't really be torn down. So maybe they're your domain controllers, maybe they are your firewall, right? Whether you have a pay-as-you-go license or you're got a BYOL license, that firewall can't really be powered down, right? So this helps you start to build on the kind of the costs, right? You'll be able to start thinking about plotting out budgets. This will give you a lot of data to move forward, so you can think about optimizing your environment and take into consideration some recommendations. So let's say you start with a pretty high series D series VM. You take a look at your recommendations, you realize, oh, it's a domain controller. Oh, I could probably get by with even a B series VM. It's a more inexpensive model. It's going to stay on all the time. And so you could think about reducing your overall OpEx costs on a monthly basis. And then that also allows you to start figuring out the ways in which you're going to manage your invoices and payments, right? Are you going to have a chargeback model? Most companies do. Then we've got blueprints, right? So this allows you to think about workload, kind of dividing it up, right? How are you going to think about AI? How are you going to think about big data solutions? What about hybrid networks, right? You can think about identity management, IoT, serverless, SAP, VMs, web apps, and DevOps. Blueprints can be plugged into every single one of them, and all blueprints are, it's kind of like a real true architectural blueprint. It's exactly how you want your environment to look like, so it's easy to manage, maintain, keep up, and you've got consistency across the entire environment. So the blueprints become really awesome here, helping you build that ready state so you've got your landing zone environment. And then in terms of the next phase here, you move into migrate. So we've got the assess period, which we've already kind of done up to this point again, but you'll want to make sure you have a good handle on all the assets you've accumulated data on so you can build that full-blown plan. You've got the landing zone, you've got the skilling plan in place, you've got the drivers that everybody is understanding, right? You want to reduce CapEx costs, you want to free up a data center, you've got quantitative factors, so you've got to think about what VMs you're going to be building. Are you going to be replicating those VMs into Azure? Or are you going to be building net new? You've got to think about networking, compatibility. How are your apps going to live in Azure? There's a lot of like for like, but then there are some caveats you have to consider and think through related to business needs and drivers. And then from there, the qualitative factors would be things like process dependencies or critical business events. Then we move into this rehost phase where you're thinking about a lift and shift methodology, and we'll talk about a great tool that is a native tool to Azure that can help out here. This will give you the on-prem functionality, but you're going to be using the cloud native technology, so you get the scale and agility of the cloud, but you didn't have to do much outside of move your VM from one environment to another. And I think every sysadmin's been doing that since I feel like the dawn of virtualization, at least. You were constantly moving a VM from one version of vSphere or one version of Hyper-V to a newer version. Same concept here. It's just now you're moving it into Azure. And then there's the Azure migration guide, which I'll talk through and I'll showcase where to find some of this. When you think about the next phase of this, or the next kind of component of this, it'll be the optimization, kind of, I guess, period, where you want to figure out, can this VM be down at certain points of the day? This VM's only really heavily used from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, Central Time. Great, we'll keep that VM up then. You could think about plugging in different licensing programs to kind of optimize costs and get yourself to that ready state. But basically, you want to deliver the right experience within budget, and you want to be really cost conscious here. And a lot of times that landing zone becomes the really good way of kind of the shoe-in for what comes next, because you'll understand what it's like to have kind of a steady state. You'll then be able to understand some of the advisor recommendations that come in from Azure, some of the ways in which to think about better security posture, et cetera. And then you can think about leaning on this optimization section to help out what you're trying to do. And then when you think about kind of the secure and manage pieces, so, you can prepare what you've migrated for ongoing operations. And that's everything from security, monitoring, configuration management. There's all kinds of agility you can plug into once your asset or your VM lives closer to all the ARM APIs. It's a pretty cool thing here. So, any enterprise scale adoption plan, it includes workloads that don't require significant investments in the creation of new business assets, right? So this migrate period becomes that first kind of foyer into the Azure environment, right? You're moving your environment like for like into Azure. The next phase of this, and it's still adoption, right? But it's the innovative side. So it's the idea that certain assets could probably spend cycles up front and go through a cloud native exercise, right? Maybe you've got some savvy developers. Maybe you've got some apps that you have not yet built. It doesn't make sense to throw it on a server on-prem if you're vacating a data center. So this might be a good opportunity to think about leaning on some of the really cool tooling and really cool resources inside of Azure, right? So the idea of leaning on Kubernetes, container orchestration, pacifying what you can to be able to get yourself away from the traditional VM world. This allows you to take into consideration resiliency, global scale, agility, security, and auto scaling, and it's all orchestrated for you. Then you can think about refactor. So this would be taking an application that already exists on-prem, and this would be kind of fitting it into a PaaS or a serverless-based model. So that helps you develop the skills to get to where you need to be, right? I think everybody wants to be PaaS. There's always an evolution cycle here, but sometimes different customers have savvy developers. So this becomes a really interesting component to think through, this innovates phase. This provides a shorter path to completion. So this really leans into that agile methodology where you're not having to wait months for an environment to come online. Your developers are taking pre-existing code, they're refactoring it ever so slightly, building up kind of the muscles they need to move forward, and they're taking into consideration the ability to be able to refactor apps. Re-architect would be kind of more so, well, modifying existing applications. So, it's weird because I think refactor and re-architect are very similar. Re-architect might be kind of one step ahead of refactor. Refactor is fitting it into kind of a PaaS-based model. Re-architect is making it to be full-blown containers or something like that. Could be app service. You can take advantage of the cloud native benefits here, and so you get more. You get increased scale and agility, easier adoption of new cloud capabilities. You can mix your technology stacks, et cetera. So I think of refactor and re-architect as very close together, and it kind of gets real muddy on where they kind of separate. But re-architect would be kind of building it out, taking an existing app, building it out brand new. Refactor would be kind of taking it as is and like massaging it and making it work. Whereas re-architect, it's a little bit more like rip and replace. Although
you kind of have your like walk, your crawl, walk, run a little bit there with the refactor, re-architect, rebuild. In terms of where your skill set might lie within your organization, and how and to what level they're going to innovate that application is
Yeah.
kind of the way I would see it and think of it.
Well, yeah, and it's fun. You notice how they're all kind of blending together for me as I'm telling this narrative. I'm like, because then rip and
Exactly.
replace would be rebuild. Yeah. So it gets even muddy for me when I have conversations with customers because I can now go talk to devs. It's funny because most devs, when they find out I really wasn't a dev before, they were very shocked. But I wasn't a dev. But when I talk with them, it's interesting to see the different ways in which they realize paths and take on paths and refactor what they've done and build out net new and kind of rip and replace and come up with cloud native based technology for that full blown rebuilding phase of the innovate stage. And then the last stage here is DevOps. So I think most folks understand that DevOps is not just a tool, right? It makes it really complex because Azure DevOps has DevOps in the name, but DevOps really is a kind of people, process, and technology. So getting to a faster end state to where you can finally rebuild apps, right? Kind of moving from, abstracting the infrastructure, moving to containers, refactoring those apps, re-architecting, rebuild. You get to a point where you can build things faster and you can go through development cycles much quicker, where you can do testing and release. You can think about monitoring everything. You can do the value streaming, right? You can do the right levels of mapping how all of that works because you've got the right levels of monitoring. And as a result, the overall management of this side of the CAF becomes a lot easier. Now, granted, it's not like it's an overnight sensation. I wish it was. It'd make things so much easier. But it helps to have folks that are willing to fail quickly, fail fast, so they can get back up and keep building, right? So that really hits home on the DevOps culture.
Yeah, it's really a mindset in a lot of ways, and taking on a specific mindset and how you're going to take on and continuously improve and continuously deploy and set up the process, like you said, people, process, and technology, and putting that all together on a full cycle, continuous motion.
Yes. Yes, correct. Yep. And then that takes you kind of into the next stage, which is govern, right? So this is where you take into consideration your business risks. So you talk through evolving how that looks like, and you want to document how all of this is going to continue to change. You have to figure out what your risk tolerance is because you want your developers to go experiment, but you want them to experiment on dummy data, not real data, right? So you want to be able to provide an awesome playing ground with a set of rules to follow. And then when it comes time to production, maybe you want to take all of that risk and responsibility out, and you want to have something like a CI/CD tool like Azure DevOps come in and do the full-blown production builds. I've worked with customers who can get to that point, but again, it's a quick shift of the mind. You can think through some of your policy and compliance pieces here. So you want to convert those risk decisions into kind of policy statements, and you want to establish those cloud boundaries so that your developers and your engineers, it's not just developers, but I tend to think of developers as the ones that are more inclined to experiment and to try and figure out how to move into that innovate stage. But your engineers, your regular cloud-based engineer, do the exact same thing. You want to have a way in which that people can move forward, continue to build up the skill, and understand what that looks like related to a cloud transformation. In terms of the processes, you want to make sure that you're able to kind of monitor everything as it stands. You want to make sure everything adheres to corporate policies. And this is where it becomes a really important component here to have that cloud center of excellence, which is, I think of it like a cross-pollinated team. It's not just developers. It's not just infrastructure folks. It's not just security folks. It's not just business managers. It's somebody probably from each one of those teams coming in and being a part of this cloud center of excellence, because that center of excellence starts building out what the cost management looks like, right? So they understand what it looks like to pay attention to the budgets, right? They create cost accountability. They figure out, what the spend is going to look like, and they limit what they can where they need to. They can also think about the security baseline. So you want to make sure that matches up to your requirements as a firm, so that your customers so that your developers and your engineers aren't going out and putting a public IP on everything and, opening everything up to the world so that you get hacked, right? You want to have some sort of baseline built out, and that's really a good idea to have the Cloud Center of Excellence take on that task. The Cloud Center of Excellence also helps related to the resource consistency. So that helps you related to your naming standards, your resource group kind of organization, the you kind of understanding what goes where. Also subscription management, right? Like, are we going to have multiple subscriptions based upon the multiple business units that we've got at this company? They can also think through the identity baseline. So this is where you'd figure out who gets access to what and why. It's the path of the least privilege, right? The folks that have the most privilege, it should be a small select few. And then you want to give, your engineers, your doers of things inside your environment, the right levels of access. They don't over provision or all of a sudden have a sprawling environment. And then if you factor in kind of each one of these, and you factor in the idea of you're documenting all of this into some sort of governance plan, you're building out policies, you're automating certain tasks here, because, I mean, let's be honest, if I didn't have something that told me I couldn't go build something, I would go build something, right? So always leaning on tooling to help get what you're looking for, you can really start to see that deployment accelerate. So you've got an opportunity to centralize templates that you're using for deployment, which drives consistency and it drives that standardization. In terms of the managing and operations side of this, so that's kind of the last phase, so to speak, or last piece to kind of touch on here. So, having everything accounted for allows you to identify critical applications critical operations for business operations, so that you don't expose yourself in an unnecessary way. And this allows you to map operations to services. So really, once you've gone through this whole journey, you have a much better way of seeing how everything's being deployed. This helps you analyze services and dependencies, right? As well as it helps you create dashboards. I think that's the cool thing that a lot of management didn't have prior to cloud, because they never really thought about it, right? They now have capacity to build out dashboards to figure out how things are working on a regular basis. When you think about kind of monitoring, you've got the data collection in a much different fashion. So you've got access to so much more data than you ever did before, especially if you're leaning on Azure native monitoring tooling. And it helps you, generate the alerts, helps you maintain certain SLAs for your apps as they stand. And then that helps kind of tie into resiliency. So, after you've kind of gone through all of these phases here, you should have a much more resilient platform. You should be able to build out recovery from failures with minimal downtime. I've seen customers be able to recover within a matter of seconds, a matter of hours, whereas prior to the cloud, it would take possibly days or two because they might have to go restore from a tape, right? I feel like those days are gone, but I keep hearing customers who have tapes, so it's fine. I get why people still have tapes, but it's also one of those things too, thinking about the cloud and realizing some of the value of that speed, you can think about bringing environments back online if there was a failure. And then you kind of think through an evolution here, you get to that point of a highly available platform. So let's talk a little bit about the assessments and plans. I'll kind of highlight it here, and then I'll move over into, how are we doing on time? I'll move into like where to find some of this, and maybe what we do here, Dwayne, is we don't go through the last little section here because I think we've only got about 11 minutes or so. So let's go into the cloud journey tracker. So the links here will take you to the right spots to take a look at this. And really what it's doing is it helps you identify cloud adoption path, or the specific path you should probably take based upon your specific needs. So it helps you, navigate to relevant content in the CAF as well. So the CAF is just like every other piece of Microsoft documentation. There's an overview page, and then there's a bunch of different links underneath. And then they'll take you to where you need to go in terms of the documentation, but it's a lot of content. And if you aren't really sure where you need to go outright, these are fantastic kind of first passes of trying to figure out how to make some of this work. The Azure Architecture Review, this kind of assesses your workload through the lenses of cost, resiliency, DevOps practices, security, and scalability. That's really awesome. I won't go through that one today because I think we'll go through that one next week, but kind of bookmark this link and you'll get to where you need to go. The governance benchmark is on the next slide here, and then this one really helps you set up a governance baseline using the methodology defined in the CAF. So the assessment itself identifies gaps in the baseline setup and recommends kind of where to start to have an MVP. So the 2 links at the bottom here take you to where you need to go, and these are fantastic links to dig into. And there's no right or wrong answer here. Like I said, these are just kind of like a choose your own adventure assessment, right? Like I would like to do this, then you go to kind of the next piece of the documentation. And then in terms of the cloud adoption plan, there are 2 more pieces here that I think we want to talk through. So there's the DevOps plan generator, and I'll showcase where that lives. So if you're ever familiar with the Azure DevOps demo generator, you can now plug in a specific template to use that gives you a bunch of pre-populated work items that would live in a Kanban board inside of Azure DevOps. And it's super cool because you can take them, you can adjust them, you can move them into sprint planning. It's a cool reality where we didn't have this even like 7 or 8 months ago, maybe like even a year ago, let's say. I think about a little less than a year ago, these were created. And then there's a number of templates too. So this looks more like a Word doc, and I will pull it up so that you can take a look at it. But this helps you kind of build out what that governance plan would potentially look like.
All right, so you can pull that up right now?
Yes, I am. So let's do this. So I'm going to share. Got a bunch of things open. So I won't go into the well-architected review because I think we'll spend some time going through that when we actually cover that in our next session. But the Cloud Journey Tracker is pretty awesome here. So it's got the time in which you start it, right? And then it's the strategy, and it's what areas interest you. Now, granted, I started some of this to play around with it, but it's as simple as just adding that in, right? Oh, actually, hang on. I have to click in. There we go. Okay, how would you describe your cloud journey, right? Well, we selected Azure as the cloud provider, but we haven't deployed anything yet. So then you can go and you can add notes here. This is all helpful for you. Nobody from Microsoft's going to call you. This is really for your own benefit. Then you can kind of go into here, right, where this is a strategy. I want to estimate cost of what it's going to look like. I want to get the infrastructure ready. I want to be able to manage operations, improve performance, right? So you could select all of these. There's no really right or wrong way to do it. And you keep kind of moving in here throughout this whole thing. And then once you're done, so here I'll go back out to the assessments. Once you're done here, like let's say you get distracted and you have to come back. You can always come back to it, right? So it'll just say in progress. When you're done here, it's going to have all the actionable results and where you need to go, which is kind of a cool reality, especially because of the fact that I think what we used to have was a lot of documentation, but not a lot of things to go back to and refer to. So this is kind of a nice, I joke it's a little more like Cliff Notes version of probably what you want to pay attention to. And then in terms of down here, the developer velocity is a new one. I actually haven't gone in here. It's not as old as the other ones, and by old I mean these are not even that old. Let's be honest. So this is a newer one. I haven't spent too much time in that here, so I won't go in there just yet. But it looks like this is how to kind of get to that innovate side, and it looks like it's some checklists and things of that sort. The governance benchmark is similar. But it's going to require that you select a role, you title your or you give your, out kind of your company name here, and you select the industry. So I won't do that, but this helps you start in on the governance benchmark. And then this is the strategic assessment and migration readiness tool. So it's very similar to the adoption, the cloud adoption. And you can go through here and answer these questions. And what you wind up, so has your company identified a compelling we have? Click next. Executive commitment secured, funding commitment in progress, right? Maybe we have both. Somewhere, usually it's kind of like right in these two when we're at this point with customers. Not connect with a migration partner. These are great ways for you to kind of provide some info on the ways in which to get yourself started. So same thing here. You go back to the assessments, and you'll have both of these sitting here, and they're both sitting in an in-progress state, which is kind of cool. The Azure DevOps demo generator. This is where you get the piece here. So it's literally Azure DevOps demo generator.azurewebsites.net. Sign in. I am signed in, so I will select. I'll select my org. Hopefully it shows. Oh, okay. Yeah, there we go. Choose template. And these are actually, there's more of them. Wow. So There's the cloud adoption plan. This will pre-populate with a lot of cool stuff related to the Kanban board sprint planning. I'll show you. I've got it sitting in my actual one of my other orgs here, but it looks like you've got the server migration. AKS is short for Azure Kubernetes Service. This is the DevOps project task list. This is the SQL CAF DevOps project task list. So you can suck all these in, and what it looks like is you've got a bunch of different things to pull from. So a lot of it, I should say, probably not every single thing's relevant. A good chunk of it might be relevant. But like if you wanted to go and figure out how to view and retrieve Azure activity log events, you could go in here and it will show you where the tutorial lives online, and you can assign this to yourself. You can start moving this into your boards, which is kind of cool. So this all could be easily plugged into your environment without issue. You could even add new items. Let's say you wanted to focus on something that didn't get covered. I mean, these are pretty expansive things to think through, but if there was ever something that you didn't have, you could always add that in, which is kind of cool. This is the cloud adoption plan. So this is where you start to get info on the ways in which you can think about your digital estate, your initial organizational alignment, your skills readiness plan, and your cloud adoption plan. This is the template I was talking about. I think it just, yeah, there we go. So it opened on a different page. I'll move it over here. So this kind of looks like a good policy document, right? So the beauty here is, I think, prior to this being in existence, a lot of customers would start from scratch, right? You don't have to start from scratch now. You can think about putting some of these into these templates, and that kind of helps increase the agility here, so you don't potentially have analysis by paralysis, or you're trying to solve for everything out the gate. And the idea here is to be iterative in your approach. And then I think I wanted to showcase the Quick Start Center here as well. Let's go in here. So the Quick Start Center has Azure Setup Guidance and Azure Migration Guidance and the Azure Innovation Guide. So these are pretty cool in the sense that you can go in here, you can think about how to manage access, right? And these are great visuals if you needed to go into the documentation. I love how it all is tied in very easily here. You can go to the right section in our documentation because, like I had mentioned, it's like a lot of other services of Azure. You've got kind of your overview section and then a bunch of good documentation underneath, but it's hard to know where to go. So the Quick Start Center is an awesome awesome spot to find yourself. And then the migration guide is similar, so you can go in here to the assess workloads. We will go through the Azure Migrate tool here in a couple of weeks. You can think about all of the different components here, and the innovation guide is also similar, right? So prepare for customer feedback, democratize data, engage customers through apps. So these are really good guides to help you get to where you need to be. And, this didn't used to be there. So I like the fact it's there now. I like the fact that you're not starting from scratch. It's a lot like our code base, right? When you think about building out ARM templates, you're not starting from scratch. Same thing now exists for all of these policies, these higher level, more gray areas. I joke there are a lot of squishy areas. You now have some concrete guidance or templates or, assessment tools to help you as you think about your cloud adoption framework.
Oh, great stuff. All right. So
I stopped sharing.
Yep.
And the one thing we didn't cover was the CAF governance model. So what we could probably do is bolt that on to the well-architected framework. So we will. It's important. We'll cover it. We didn't practice as much as I thought we did.
We'll start with the governance model as we go into well-architected framework in next week's talk. But we did cover at a very deep level what the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure is. We went very deeply into that framework, and then you got to see some of the tools that Microsoft has made available for the assessment and planning, and the great tools that just get you started, which is really helpful. So I think that's great stuff there. So So that brings us to the end of this week's Thinking Cloudy Expert Talk episode on the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. Like Shannon said, we have multiple sessions scheduled over the next 6 weeks to really dive deep into this whole migration journey into the Azure environment. So please tune in. Next Wednesday, we'll be getting into the well-architected framework episode. We've got landing zones coming up the week after that, Azure Migrate, Azure Arc, operations evolution are all topics that we'll be covering during this series of episodes that me and Shannon will be presenting to you. So once we're all done here early December with these sessions, you should be ready and raring to go for cloud adoption within Azure. So my name's Dwayne Natwick.
I'm Shannon Kuehn.
And we want to thank you very much. All of these episodes, check out previously recorded episodes. Shannon and I did one on VMware for Azure a couple months ago. That's up on our YouTube page. It's also available on our skillmeup.com page. So any of the previous episodes are available in both those places on the Skill Me Up YouTube channel. As well as the Skill Me Up website. And the Skill Me Up website is also the place to access for any upcoming live training that we are doing as well. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks.